It started with footprints. They came out of the woods and led straight to the door of a farmhouse. A long, single path. Clean, deep impressions in the snow. But there were no footprints going back. Whoever it was walked in and stayed. The family inside didn't call for help. No one reported anything strange. The house remained quiet. From the outside, it looked as though everything was fine. The dog barked occasionally. The cows were milked. A chimney let out smoke. But inside the house, 6 people were dead. Some of them were left where they fell. Others were hidden, stacked together in the barn and covered with straw. Whoever did it didn't leave in a hurry. They fed the animals, slept in the family's beds, cooked food in their kitchen, and waited. This was not a robbery. It wasn't an act of rage. It was something else entirely. And in the 100 years since, no one has ever been able to explain it. This happened in 1922, in the heart of Bavaria. The house sat alone between 2 small towns, too far for a scream to carry, too close for anyone to forget. The locals called it Hinterkaifeck, and what happened there remains one of the most disturbing and unsolved crimes in European history. You're not going to hear wild theories, not yet. You're going to hear what really happened, in the order it happened, slowly, quietly, and if you listen carefully, maybe you'll notice something the others missed. Keep the lights low, let the rain fall, and stay with me until the house speaks for itself. Let's begin, not with death, but with the quiet life that came before it. In 1922, the Gruber family lived on a secluded farmstead in the Bavarian countryside of Germany. It wasn't listed on any major map. You wouldn't stumble across it by accident. The farm sat between 2 tiny villages, Kaifeck and Gruber, down a narrow, muddy road called Hinterkaifeck. It wasn't a name meant to be remembered, but it would be. The house was sturdy, 2 stories, simple, functional, barn attached, as was common then. No electricity, no phone, just kerosene lanterns, wood stoves, and silence. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was 63rd stern, harsh by all accounts. A man of few smiles. His wife Cecilia was 72nd quieter, reserved. Some say she'd learned over time to let silence be her shield. Their daughter, Victoria Gabriel, 35, had moved back after the war. Her husband had died in combat. She returned with her little girl, 7-year-old Cecilia, and later gave birth to a second child, Joseph. He was 2, but Joseph's father, no one could say for sure. And then there was the maid, Maria Baumgartner. She had just arrived, and she wouldn't live to see her second day. People in town spoke in whispers about the Grubers. Andreas was known to be difficult, proud, a man who didn't trust easily. His neighbors kept their distance. Rumors swirled about his temper, and something worse, something between him and his daughter, Victoria. In 1915, the 2 were actually arrested, accused of incest. Andreas was jailed, Victoria as well. She gave birth to Joseph while her husband was away at war. And when he never returned, that baby became the center of endless suspicion. Was he her son? Was he her brother? Or was he both? No one ever answered that. Not really. And the people in the nearby villages, they stopped asking. But the tension wasn't just inside the family. There were signs, things that didn't make sense. Weeks before the murders, Andreas mentioned finding a newspaper on the porch. It wasn't one he subscribed to. In fact, it was from a city over 70 kilometers away. No one in the household recognized it. They hadn't been into town. No visitors, no deliveries. Just the paper sitting neatly at the door. Then the keys went missing. House keys. And shortly after, footsteps in the attic. At first they thought it was wind, then mice. But it grew louder, heavier, like boots walking, pacing. Andreas searched the house, the attic, every room. He found nothing. But at night, the sounds came again. Then the maid quit. She told friends she couldn't stay there. She said the house felt wrong, not just cold, not just lonely, watched. She packed her things and left that same night. Her reason? The voices. And still, the family stayed. They kept to their routines. Chores in the morning, church on Sundays, and silence when the noises came. Andreas didn't want help. He didn't want police. He believed he could handle it. Then a new maid was hired, Maria Baumgartner. She arrived on March 31st. It was her first night on the job. It would also be her last. That evening, no one in the village saw anything strange. The family was quiet, as usual. The barn light glowed softly behind frost-covered windows. Then night fell. No one knew it yet, but by morning the house would fall silent for good. March 31st, 1922. It was a cold, quiet Friday in the German countryside. The sun rose over the trees, barely warming the early spring frost that clung to the roof of Hinterkaifeck, the Gruber family's isolated farmhouse, far from the nearest town, beyond the reach of any immediate help. By that evening, every person inside the house would be dead. But that morning, everything looked normal. There were 6 people living at Hinterkaifeck that day. Andreas Gruber, the 63-year-old patriarch. His wife, Cecilia, aged 72. Their widowed daughter, Victoria, 35. Her daughter, young Cecilia, just 7. 2-year-old Joseph, the baby. And a maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had just arrived that very afternoon. It was her first day on the job. She had traveled from nearby Schwabhausen, brought to the house by her sister. That would be the last time her sister ever saw her alive. The Grubers had a routine, and they followed it. Morning chores were done. Bread was baked. The cows were milked. Victoria collected eggs from the hen house, as she did every day. Nothing seemed out of place. But behind those quiet rituals, there were signs that something wasn't right. They had heard footsteps in the attic for days. Their keys had gone missing, and no one could explain the newspaper found on their porch that no one subscribed to. Some say Andreas had found scratches on the lock to the tool shed, as though someone had tried to get in. Others say he saw footprints leading to the barn, but none leading back. He spoke to no one about it, not even the police. He didn't trust anyone. Maybe that was a mistake. Maria, the new maid, had gone to her room to rest early that evening. Her bed was small, just wide enough for one, with a thin wool blanket. She never had a chance to unpack fully. The family ate dinner, and sometime after nightfall, the murders began. It's believed the killer lured the first 4 victims, Andreas, Victoria, the elder Cecilia, and the child, one by one into the barn. How? No one can say for sure. Perhaps they heard a noise, a strange sound, a thud. Maybe one of the animals was disturbed. Andreas, always in control, would have gone first. In the dim barn light, with hay underfoot and cows shifting quietly in their pens, He was struck in the head with a mattock, a heavy, sharpened farm tool. He died instantly. Victoria followed. She, too, was hit in the skull, hard, clean. Then Cecilia, the elder, and finally little Cecilia. But she didn't die right away. She lived long enough to pull out tufts of her own hair, found clenched in her fists, likely from shock and pain as she lay beside her family, bleeding, breathing, and waiting in the dark. They were found later stacked on top of each other, a grotesque pile of bodies, covered in hay, as if someone wanted to hide them, but not bury them. After the barn, the killer returned to the house. There, Maria, the maid, lay in her room. She never stood a chance. One swing to the head, immediate, no sign of a struggle. Then Joseph, 2 years old, in his cot, killed while he slept. The horror should have ended there, but it didn't. Whoever committed these murders didn't run. They stayed. And that's the most chilling part of this entire story. For 4 days, the house was occupied, not by the family, by the killer. The cows were still milked each morning. The dog was fed. The fireplace was lit. Meals were taken from the pantry. Neighbors passed by the farm and assumed all was well. They saw the chimney smoking. They heard the dog bark. One neighbor even said she saw someone walking near the barn from a distance, a shadowy figure, barely visible in the morning mist. But no one approached. Even more disturbing, the mailman noticed something unusual. Each day, the curtains in the windows were drawn open in the morning. Each evening, they were closed, as though someone inside was keeping up appearances. Finally, on April 4th, the silence became too much. The local repairman arrived to fix a machine and found no one answering. Victoria hadn't attended church that Sunday, highly unusual for her, and young Cecilia hadn't shown up for school. Neighbors grew suspicious. A small group gathered outside the house that evening. They knocked. No answer. They walked around the back toward the barn, and then they found it. Under loose hay were the bodies, 4 of them, stacked in the barn. It was hard to even tell them apart at first. Andreas, Victoria, Cecilia, and young Cecilia. One of the men vomited on the spot. Another sat down and refused to move. Inside the house, they found Maria and Joseph, both dead, still, cold. The police were called, but the damage was done. The crime scene had already been disturbed. Investigators came from Munich. But the investigation was sloppy. No forensics, no gloves, no photos of the scene before it was handled. In fact, the autopsies were done right there in the barn, using the family's own kitchen tools. April 5th, 1922. The farmhouse at Hinterkaifeck had become a crime scene. Inside, 6 bodies. Outside, dozens of questions. And over everything, silence. Police arrived from Munich that morning, but by then the damage had already been done. Neighbors had walked through the house, touched things, moved things. The barn, where 4 of the victims were found, had been opened, disturbed. The bodies uncovered and restacked, footprints trampled. It wasn't malicious. It was human. A small village reacting to something no one had ever seen before. But it made solving the crime almost impossible. The first problem was the weather. Snow had fallen again overnight. Whatever tracks might have been outside were gone. The only prints they could confirm were the ones from before the murders, leading to the farmhouse. Still, no prints leading away. The killer had vanished without leaving a trail. The second problem was the forensics. There were none. No crime scene tape, no gloves, no cataloging of evidence. In fact, the autopsies were done right there in the barn, with the family's own kitchen knives, washed between uses but not sterilized. The doctor, Johann Baptist Almüller, had no tools of his own and few answers to offer. All 6 victims had been killed with a blunt force object, likely a mattock. The wounds were severe, mostly to the head. Most died instantly, except for young Cecilia. She had bruises on her face and neck, hair clutched in her fists. She had lived for hours, possibly an entire night, after her injury, slowly suffocating in the straw beside her mother's body. It was the smallest, most tragic detail in the entire case. Maria, the maid, had been killed in her room. The blow crushed her skull completely. Her arms were folded over her chest, possibly post-mortem. Joseph, the baby, had been smothered and hid. His bassinet remained undisturbed. Police found no signs of forced entry. The doors were locked, the windows intact. Money and valuables were left untouched. The killer had entered and exited without breaking in, likely using a key, possibly the one that had gone missing weeks earlier. But it wasn't just what was missing that made things confusing. It was what had been left behind. Food had been eaten, fresh bread sliced, meat missing from the pantry, plates in the sink. The dog was fed, barking when strangers arrived, alert but not starving. Multiple villagers would later swear that over the weekend they heard movement inside the house, footsteps, the clinking of glass, a door closing, but no voices. Each day the curtains were drawn open in the morning and closed again at night. Someone was keeping up appearances. One neighbor even claimed they saw smoke coming from the chimney long after the murders. The implication was clear. The killer didn't just kill, they stayed for hours, maybe days, sleeping, eating, living inside the house, among the dead. The town was small. Everyone knew each other. Everyone had theories. As the police began their investigation, they focused on people the family already knew. The first name that came up was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the Gruber's neighbor. He was the first person to enter the home and discover the bodies. He was also rumored to be Joseph's real father. At one point, Lorenz had wanted to marry Victoria, but Andreas refused. There were court records that showed Lorenz had once paid child support, and then abruptly stopped. When asked how he entered the house so confidently, Lorenz said, "The door was locked, so I used my own key." That raised eyebrows. Why did he still have a key? Lorenz claimed he must have kept one from a previous visit months ago. But that didn't match what others in the village remembered. He was interrogated multiple times. Each time, his story shifted slightly. He was never arrested. But for the rest of his life, people whispered that he knew more than he said. The next theory focused on 2 brothers, known only as the Gumps. They had criminal records. One of them had once threatened Andreas during a land dispute, but both had alibis. One was in jail. The other was confirmed to be hundreds of miles away. Still, rumors swirled. A local boy claimed he saw 2 men watching the barn from the woods. No one else could confirm this. And then there was the most mysterious theory of all. It involved Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel. Officially, Carl had died in World War I, but his body was never recovered, and over the years, multiple German soldiers came forward claiming they'd seen a man who matched Carl's description, alive, living under a different name in Austria. One even claimed Carl had admitted to returning home and discovering Victoria had borne a child with another man. Could he have come back, disfigured from the war, unrecognizable and furious? Could he have been the one hiding in the attic? Listening, waiting, there was no proof, just speculation, and a name that would never appear on a death certificate. The deeper police looked, the stranger things became. They found a small crawl space in the attic with hay scattered across it, as if someone had been sleeping there. The barn loft had fresh prints, but the snow had melted, making it impossible to identify them. No fingerprints were collected. No murder weapon was found. Years later, a rusted mattock, the presumed murder weapon, was discovered buried in a nearby shed. But by then, it was too late to test, too late to matter. By the summer of 1922, police had no answers. In 1923, the house was demolished. Nothing was ever rebuilt there. And as the years passed, the Hinterkaifeck case became one of Europe's most haunting unsolved mysteries. 6 people murdered, no arrests, no confessions, no conclusions, only silence and shadows. When the murders at Hinterkaifeck became public, Germany froze. It wasn't just the brutality. It was the way it happened. Slow, deliberate, quiet, no motive, no arrest, no escape. And most terrifying of all, it wasn't the kind of story you could forget. The nearby towns of Grebern and Kaifeck were the first to respond. Shocked, then suspicious. People who once helped each other with firewood now locked their doors, looked over their shoulders. The village split into 2 kinds of people: those convinced the killer was a stranger, and those who believed he had never left. Rumors spread fast. Some said a madman had come from the woods. Others whispered that the killer was someone the Grubers knew. A few even believed the family had been cursed. The cemetery filled to capacity the day the family was buried, but they weren't whole. Before burial, the heads of all 6 victims were removed, sent to Munich for forensic analysis. They were never returned. To this day, the bodies rest in marked graves without skulls. And still, the stories didn't stop. Visitors to the ruins of Hinterkaifeck claimed to hear things. Footsteps in the attic, a child crying softly in the barn, a woman singing, though no one was there. One hunter said his dog refused to approach the property, growling and whimpering until they turned back. Some farmers swore they saw lights glowing in the upper windows of the house, even after it had been destroyed. Eventually, locals gave the site a nickname: the house that ate its family. Children were warned not to walk near the forest paths behind it. Travelers passing by after dark claimed the trees felt off, too quiet, too still. And no matter how many years passed, the suspicion never really faded. The case was reopened multiple times. No new evidence, no arrest, but plenty of theories. Here are the ones that history refuses to forget. The first, the lover's revenge. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor, the man who may have been Joseph's father, the first to find the bodies. Some believed he was bitter, that Victoria rejected him, that Andrea stood in his way, and that Lorenz, humiliated and furious, snapped, that he waited until the perfect moment, the arrival of the new maid, knowing the entire household would be together. Then he carried it out, calculated, cold. He knew the property. He had a key. He was the first on the scene and the only one who seemed unshaken. But there's no proof, only questions, and a man who, until the day he died, denied everything. The second theory: Carl Gabriel returned, Victoria's husband, officially killed in the war. But no body was ever recovered. In the years that followed, several German POWs claimed to have seen a man who looked like Carl, living under another name in Austria. One even claimed Carl confessed to returning home and discovering Victoria had a child by another man. Was the shame too much? Did he snap? Or was it all just rumor? No one claiming to be Carl ever came forward. No record surfaced. And time moved on. The third theory: the farmhand, a former worker, a drifter, someone who knew the routines, the barn, the attic crawl space, someone with a grudge, or perhaps someone unwell. Several former employees were interviewed. One disappeared shortly after the murders. His identity was never confirmed. The final theory, and the darkest: a ritual killing. Years later, letters surfaced in police files suggesting the bodies were arranged deliberately. The killer took time, stacked the victims, covered them with hay. No money was taken, no valuables stolen, only lives and peace. Some believed it was symbolic. Others believed it was the work of a cult. But there were no markings, no writings, nothing left behind to say why. By the 1950s, Hinterkaifeck had become legend. Books were written, folklore passed down. The story spread like an old ghost tale. But unlike fiction, this was true. Every word, every silence. In the 1970s, and again in the early 2000s, detectives revisited the case. They tried new profiling tools, interviewed remaining relatives, reviewed dusty files. Still, no answers. Some records have been lost, others sealed. The official stance? The case remains unsolved. The killer likely lived nearby and may have returned to everyday life unnoticed. Today, the house is gone, but the field remains, and so does the story. 6 people murdered. No closure, no justice, only mystery. And for those who still whisper about it, only one name matters: Hinterkaifeck. Some stories end with a name, a killer caught, a motive revealed, a sentence passed. But this story never got that. Hinterkaifeck gave us only silence and a house that watched and waited. What makes it so haunting isn't just how the family died, it's how they lived, isolated, surrounded by suspicion, slowly unraveling beneath the surface of routine, the footsteps, the keys, the attic. The Grubers were never truly alone, not even in their last days. For over a century, the mystery of Hinterkaifeck has remained one of Europe's most unsettling unsolved crimes. 5. In the stories still whispered at night, and Hinterkaifeck wasn't the only one. There were others, other homes, other nights where silence turned deadly. Let's look quietly at 3 real cases that carry eerie similarities. Case 1, the Villisca Axe Murders, Iowa, 1912. 8 people were found dead, a family, 2 overnight guests, each struck in their sleep with an axe. No forced entry. The killer hid in the attic, waited until night fell, and disappeared without a trace. No arrests, no motive, and more than a century later, still no answers. Case 2, the Keddy Cabin Murders, California, 1981. A remote cabin, a mother, her children, 2 guests, murdered brutally with knives and a hammer. 1 child went missing. Her remains were found years later. Despite evidence, the investigation was botched. The suspects were known. Still, no one was charged. Case 3, the Copycat, France, 2017. A rural family, bludgeoned, stacked in a barn. Some claimed it mirrored Hinterkaifeck, the arrangement, the calmness, the way the killer lingered, but investigators found no connection, only coincidence, or maybe a reminder that some horrors repeat, not because they're copied, but because evil doesn't need instructions. It finds its way. And maybe that's why stories like this stay with us, because they remind us how quickly the familiar can vanish. A warm home, a locked door, a daily routine, and then silence. The killer at Hinterkaifeck didn't run. They didn't rush. They stayed, fed the animals, ate the food, slept in the beds, and when they were done, they left nothing behind but questions and cold. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying, for listening, for wondering. You've now heard what happened, what was found, and what never made sense. If this story moved you, confused you, haunted you, you're not alone. Leave a thought, share a theory, or simply remember the name, Hinterkaifeck, because stories like these don't end, they echo. And somewhere in the woods beyond the fields, someone still walks without leaving footprint. Late in the summer of 1972, a teenage girl left her home in a quiet New Jersey suburb. She said she was going to visit a friend. The distance wasn't far. She didn't carry a bag or pack for anything more than an afternoon. It was warm that day. The sun hung low, the sidewalks were dry, and nothing seemed unusual. No one who saw her could have imagined it would be the last time. Her home remained untouched, no signs of a struggle. Her room was just as she'd left it. The day passed, then another, and then the concern turned to panic. Flyers went up. Searches began. There were no witnesses, no vehicles reported, no clothing found by the roadside, not even a shoe. The police began their investigation with the usual questions. They looked into friends, neighbors, boyfriends, even teachers. The trail led nowhere. Weeks passed. The story started to slip from the headlines. Most assumed she had run away. Some held on to hope. Others didn't speak about it at all. But in the 6th week, a clue surfaced. Not from a search party, not from a tip, but from a dog. It brought something back. Something that shouldn't have been in its mouth. And what followed after that was far stranger than anyone was prepared for. Police returned to the area with volunteers. It led them to a spot high above the town, where brush and broken rock surrounded the edge of an abandoned quarry. The ridge had a name locals didn't use in polite company. It wasn't printed on maps. There, beneath branches and loose stone, they found something, not buried, not hidden, but resting in plain view, as if placed there deliberately. Even after the recovery, questions outweighed answers. No fingerprints, no weapon, no official cause of death. Only silence. There was no indication she had fallen. There were no broken limbs. There was no sign of violence on the surface. But the arrangement of the scene suggested intent. Objects placed around her that no one could explain. The newspapers covered it briefly. They listed the facts, but left out the speculation. Police offered no motive, no suspects, no direction for the public. But within the town, people were already talking. They remembered odd events that had been brushed aside, unsettling sounds, missing pets, symbols drawn in chalk beneath overpasses, rumors that had once seemed absurd. There were no charges, no convictions, and eventually no official conclusion. Yet the story continued to live just under the surface. It never fully faded. Visitors who hiked the area said they heard whispers. Some claimed the trees above the quarry bent unnaturally toward the ridge. Hunters avoided the area entirely, and residents passing through the woods spoke of a feeling they couldn't explain, like they were being watched, but couldn't say from where. The quarry is still there. So is the street she left from. But the path between them remains unclear. Whatever happened that day didn't end when she vanished. It echoed. This is not fiction. There's no narrator inventing twists. There is only what was found and what remains unsolved. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to Night Echo. Stories like this are told slowly, in full. So turn on the bell and stay with me. From the first shadow to the final silence. Keep the lights low, let the rain continue, and listen closely until the woods speak. She was 16 years old. Her name was Jeannette DePalma, a high school junior in Springfield, New Jersey, a small, mostly quiet town with narrow streets, old houses, and neighbors who paid attention. It wasn't the kind of place where people simply disappeared, not without someone noticing. Jeannette came from a devout Christian family. She sang in her church's choir, carried a small Bible in her purse. She wasn't a recluse. She had friends. She went to school. She socialized. But she was reserved, spiritual. She stayed close to her mother. On August 7th, 1972, Jeannette told her mother she was going to visit a friend. She left her house on Clearview Road sometime in the early afternoon. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't seem nervous or upset. She just walked out the front door. She never came back. When she didn't return that night, her family grew worried. By the next morning, they began calling around, friends, classmates, neighbors. No one had seen her. No one had spoken to her that day. She hadn't arrived at her friend's house. She hadn't been seen at the train station. She wasn't with anyone people could name. On August 8th, Jeannette DePalma was officially reported missing. The police began looking quietly. There was no panic yet, no sense of foul play. She was a teenager. Some officers thought she had run away, but her family pushed back hard. They told police she wasn't like that. She didn't have a history of acting out, and if she had planned to leave, she would have said goodbye. Something felt off. Her room was untouched. Her Bible was gone, taken with her. But there was nothing else missing. No notes, no signs of distress. Still, the case remained low priority. She was 16. She could have left on her own. There were no signs of a crime. Then came the rumors. A girl from a nearby neighborhood claimed to have seen someone walking along the edge of the woods. Possibly Jeannette. She wasn't sure. The timing didn't line up exactly, but it was enough to raise questions. A few kids whispered she might have taken the path that ran behind the old Hoodile quarry. It wasn't a well-lit area. It wasn't safe. Others began speculating about strangers, suspicious cars, people who didn't belong in town. None of the leads turned into anything solid. The sightings were inconsistent. The timelines didn't match, and there was still no physical evidence. Weeks passed. Her case grew colder. Flyers began to come down. The newspapers turned their attention elsewhere. The police had no suspects, no witnesses, no proof of where she had gone. Her family refused to let it go. They pleaded for help. But without new leads, the search slowly faded. By September, it had been more than 6 weeks since she vanished. People in Springfield stopped talking about it, or if they did, they kept their voices low. But something was coming. And it didn't start with a breakthrough. It started with a dog. In part 2, an ordinary day takes a dark turn when a dog brings home something that doesn't belong in any backyard, and everything that had been quiet starts to wake up. It had been over 6 weeks since Jeannette DePalma vanished. 6 weeks of silence, unanswered questions, and quiet speculation. The police hadn't made any breakthroughs. No one had come forward. The trail was cold. Most families in Springfield had moved on with their routines. Kids returned to school. The summer faded into fall, and Jeannette's name, once mentioned in every conversation, now floated like a rumor, a cautionary tale whispered between neighbors. Missing posters still fluttered on bulletin boards and phone poles, but they had grown worn and weather-stained. Some had been torn down, others simply overlooked. No new leads, no updates, just absence. Then came the dog. It belonged to a local man who lived on the edge of the Watchung Reservation, a dense forest preserve that sprawled for miles across Union County, thick with underbrush, uneven trails, and isolated cliffs. The kind of place that swallowed sound and kept its secrets. That morning, September 19th, the dog wandered off like it always did. It was a routine thing, but when it returned, something was different. The man saw it approaching from the tree line, its fur streaked with mud, panting from the heat, and clamped in its jaws was something pale. It dropped it at the back door. The man froze. He stepped closer. It was an arm, a human arm, badly decomposed, torn at the elbow, still wearing a bracelet. The man backed away. Then he picked up the phone. Within the hour, Union County Police were on the scene. They searched the man's property, but quickly realized this wasn't the origin. The dog had fetched the arm from somewhere else. The woods were deep. The terrain was uneven, but officers focused on a part of the reservation known for its remoteness. Locals had a name for it. The Devil's Teeth, a high bluff, jagged rocks, twisting paths barely marked. Few ever ventured there. That same day, September 19th, officers made their way up the ridge, and there, at the top, they found the body. It was lying on its back, limbs spread unnaturally, exposed to the elements, already far gone in decomposition. The scene was difficult, the smell overwhelming, the positioning of the body strange. There were no clothes, no personal effects, no purse, no bag, only the body and the jewelry still attached to the wrist and neck. The officers radioed for additional units. They suspected the identity almost immediately. A missing teenage girl from Springfield, 16 years old, disappeared 6 weeks earlier. The body was transported for examination. Dental records would confirm what everyone already feared. It was Jeannette DePalma. The autopsy provided little clarity. The body was too far decomposed to determine an exact cause of death. There were no visible gunshot wounds, no obvious blunt force trauma, no stab wounds. Toxicology was inconclusive. The report listed the cause of death simply as undetermined. But those who saw the scene left with more questions than answers. Some officers, off the record, described the positioning of the body as unusual, intentional. One recalled that the rocks beneath her were laid in a kind of pattern, not random. Another believed branches had been arranged around her, and then came the word that would change everything: ritual. No photos were ever released publicly. No police report officially confirmed anything ceremonial or occult. But the idea took root, and within hours, local newspapers picked it up. Was this a sacrifice? Occult activity suspected in DePalma death. The headlines ran wild. The medical examiner pushed back. There were no markings, no proof of abuse, no evidence of a ritual. But the damage had already been done. The story was now something else, something that lived in the shadows of the Watchung woods. Jeannette wasn't just a missing girl anymore. She was the center of a growing local legend. Reporters showed up at the bluff trying to retrace the police path. TV vans parked near the trails. Locals gathered near the edge of the woods, whispering, pointing, and all the while, police refused to comment. Even the most basic questions went unanswered. Where were her clothes? Why had the dog only returned with her arm? Had the body been there the whole time? Or moved later? Was she alive when she got there? And if not, who brought her? There were no answers, only theories. And in the absence of facts, those theories took hold. One fact stood out. Her clothes were missing. Only scraps were ever recovered. A zipper, a torn piece of cloth, no shoes, no blouse, no jeans. Police searched the hillside for days. Nothing. And unlike the bracelet, her Bible wasn't found either. The last thing her mother remembered her taking, gone. The Watchung Reservation became a place of caution. Kids were told not to wander off paths. Church groups canceled retreats. Some families wouldn't even walk the trails anymore, not after hearing what was found at the top of that ridge. And then it got worse. More rumors, whispers of pentagrams, of mutilation, of animal bones arranged in circles, but none of it was ever confirmed. None of it appeared in the police file. None of it came from the coroner. Still, it became the truth that people believed. And once that happened, once the story grew teeth of its own, there was no pulling it back. Jeannette had been found, but no one felt peace. Not her parents, not the police, and not the people who now looked toward the woods. With a little more fear than before, something had happened there, something no one could explain, and something no one wanted to talk about anymore. Next, in Part 3, the media storm grows. Witnesses come forward, then vanish, and Springfield, New Jersey becomes the epicenter of one of the most unsettling unsolved deaths in American history. The news of Jeannette DePalma's death didn't come all at once. It unfolded in pieces, unsettling, incomplete, and impossible to ignore. First came the confirmation that it was her, that the body found on the bluff, exposed and decayed, belonged to the missing girl who once walked the streets of Springfield, a daughter, a classmate, a face on a flyer now replaced by a name in the paper. But what followed was stranger, not statements, not official answers. Instead, whispers. They started in living rooms, in church basements, in hallways at school. Parents spoke in hushed tones. Teenagers passed rumors between lockers, and local reporters began chasing a story that felt just out of reach. The details that made it to print were real. A 16-year-old girl had disappeared on her way to visit a friend. Her body had been found in Watchung's reservation, on a remote cliffside known to some as the Devil's Teeth. There was no clear cause of death, no obvious trauma, no suspects. But those details weren't what people talked about. What they talked about were the other things. The things not confirmed, the things not denied. They talked about the condition of her body, that it was surrounded by strange arrangements, that there were branches, stones, maybe even symbols. Some said there was a wooden cross. Others said it was more like an altar. The police refused to comment, and that silence, intentional or not, only made the fear grow louder. The Star Ledger ran a headline that made the whole state pause. Body found in alleged occult site. The word alleged did little to calm the reaction. Within days, other papers picked it up. And like a spark in dry brush, the story ignited. Talk shows debated whether Satanism had come to the suburbs. Religious leaders gave sermons warning about the devil's influence in youth culture. Parents started keeping their children home from school. People called in sightings, gave names, made accusations. And through it all, the truth remained painfully thin. Jeannette's story was no longer her own. It had been folded into something bigger, something mythic, something unknowable. She was no longer just a girl from Springfield. She was a symbol, to some a martyr, to others a warning. Even her faith became part of the narrative. Jeannette was known to be devout. She carried a Bible. She had recently rededicated herself to her beliefs, and some said she had tried to save people around her, friends, classmates, even strangers. She believed in redemption. She talked about sin. She believed in spiritual warfare. Some say she confronted a local group of teens known for their anti-religious attitudes. Not a cult, but a clique that embraced rebellion, wore black clothes, listened to heavy music, and met in the woods to drink and talk. Was it that confrontation that made her a target? Or was it all just coincidence? The Springfield police said very little. When asked about ritualistic elements at the scene, they refused to confirm or deny. They did not release photos. They issued a single-page statement that called the investigation ongoing and sensitive. But that wasn't enough, because by then the story had left the hands of the authorities and entered the imagination of the town. People said a police officer had been frightened off the case. That one investigator wouldn't go back to the bluff alone. That the forensic team had burned some of the evidence, claiming it was tainted. None of it was substantiated. All of it was repeated. Then came the letters, dozens of them, some typed, some handwritten, some barely legible. They arrived at local newsrooms, at police stations, even at the homes of reporters. One letter claimed Jeannette was the victim of a satanic sacrifice. Another said she had been targeted for trying to convert someone. One envelope contained a map of Watchung Reservation, marked with X's and arrows and cryptic notes in red ink. Police dismissed them as hoaxes, but they never revealed their contents publicly. And that silence again created space for more fear. One journalist from the Union County Local Source newspaper claimed their editor had received threatening phone calls, anonymous voices telling them to stop publishing stories about Jeannette. Another reporter said she felt followed for days after covering the story. A dark car, a man outside her apartment. She never filed a report, but she stopped writing about the case. Even now, decades later, that silence continues. Most people in Springfield don't talk about Jeannette DePalma, not openly, but if you mention the name in a certain tone, in a certain part of town, you'll see it. That flicker behind the eyes, that moment of hesitation, as if they remember, as if they still feel the weight of what happened and what never got explained. By the fall of 1972, Watchung Reservation had changed. The trails grew quiet. The woods grew darker. Signs were posted urging caution. Park rangers began patrolling more frequently. Parents forbade their children from hiking near the bluff. People said they saw strange figures at night, heard sounds that didn't belong to animals. Some said the devil's teeth had become cursed. Others said it always was. But underneath it all, Beneath the fear and rumor and silence was the memory of a girl who had simply gone out to see a friend and never came home. The autopsy on Jeannette DePalma was supposed to bring clarity. Instead, it deepened the mystery. Her body, discovered 6 weeks after she vanished, had been exposed to the elements. The sun, the rain, the insects, and the forest air had all done their work. By the time medical examiners examined her remains, there was little left that could speak. The pathologist assigned to the case issued a statement. The cause of death was undetermined. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no bullet wounds, no stab wounds, no blunt force fractures. There was no clothing that indicated a struggle. No defensive wounds could be identified. Toxicology tests, if performed, yielded nothing conclusive. There were no signs of drugs, no clear evidence of poisoning. And without definitive proof, the report offered no answers, only silence. It was a conclusion no one wanted, not the family, not the community, and certainly not the investigators under growing pressure to explain what had happened to a 16-year-old girl in the woods. But there was something else the autopsy noted. Jeannette's body had been found on top of a cliff, on a site known informally as the Devil's Teeth. According to reports from the Union County Prosecutor's Office, the positioning of the body was described as peculiar. It appeared that sticks and stones had been arranged around her remains. Some witnesses described them as forming a coffin-like shape. Others insisted the arrangement was more symbolic, possibly religious, or something else entirely. But the official line was simple. No signs of foul play could be determined. Still, that phrase didn't comfort anyone, not when the site where she was found had long been a place of local folklore. Watchung Reservation had always carried an edge of unease. Sprawling woods, hidden ravines, abandoned structures deep in the trees. It was the kind of place that drew teenagers at night, and warnings from parents by day. And now it had become something worse, a question no one could answer. If Jeannette DePalma wasn't murdered, how did she die? Did she fall? Did she overdose? Did she run away, only to return and collapse? Or was the absence of injury itself the most terrifying clue? Rumors filled the void, the occult, Satanism, ritual sacrifice. Letters continued to arrive at newspapers claiming insider knowledge. Anonymous phone calls warned reporters to stop digging. Some said that local law enforcement had buried leads. Others said Jeannette had been targeted because of her religious beliefs. The DePalma family stopped speaking to the press. They asked for privacy, and then slowly they withdrew. Springfield High School held a memorial. Her classmates brought flowers. But few spoke openly about what had happened. There was too much fear, too much uncertainty, too much left unsaid. The police investigation stalled. With no confirmed cause of death and no suspect, the case lost momentum. Files were boxed. Leads went cold. No one was arrested. No charges were filed. And within a year, Jeannette's case faded from the headlines, but not from memory. By the mid-1970s, her story had become something else. It lived in whispers, in cautionary tales, in the voice of a parent warning their child not to walk alone. Watchung Reservation became a place avoided after dark. Local teenagers spoke of shadows in the woods, strange sounds, the sense of being watched. Jeannette's story bled into the fabric of urban legend. It became impossible to separate fact from folklore. Some said her ghost still walked the trail, Others claimed animals refused to cross the bluff where she had been found. None of it could be proven, but no one could disprove it either. And then the records vanished. In the decades that followed, journalists and documentarians tried to revisit the case, but key files were missing. Some had been misplaced. Others were destroyed. The original police reports, autopsy photos, crime scene documentation, gone. Whether by accident or intention, much of the official record had been lost. What remained was memory, newspaper clippings, and the pain of a family who never got answers. Even today, more than 50 years later, Jeannette DePalma's death remains unsolved. Her name still circulates in true crime forums. Books have been written, podcasts recorded, but the core of the story has never changed. A girl disappeared, a body was found, and everything else is shadow. Years passed, and still no one could explain how Jeannette DePalma died. Her case didn't disappear, but it didn't move forward either. The files sat or vanished somewhere in the background. The grief was private. The whispers continued, and in time the trail went cold, but not everyone forgot. In the 1990s, a handful of journalists tried to revisit the case. One reporter, Mark Moran, co-founder of Weird NJ magazine, began digging. He had heard the rumors: satanic sacrifice, cult gatherings, a girl who disappeared and was left as some kind of warning. What started as a curiosity turned into something stranger, because the records weren't there. When Moran and his team submitted formal requests to local authorities asking to see the original autopsy, the coroner's photos, the police notes, they were told the documents had been lost, destroyed, moved. Each department said the same thing: "We don't have them." There was no audit trail, no digital archive, no official explanation for what had happened to the records of a girl who had died under suspicious and still unresolved circumstances. Even basic photos of the crime scene couldn't be produced. It wasn't just frustrating, it was chilling, because now the only versions of Jeannette's story that remained were the ones people remembered or imagined. In the early 2000s, interest surged again. A new generation of true crime researchers began posting about the case online. Reddit threads, podcasts, YouTube documentaries, each one tried to piece together the puzzle, but the pieces were missing, and the picture kept changing. One theory gained traction: that Jeannette had become the victim of a local predator, a serial offender, not a cult. It was rooted in simplicity, that she had gone to meet someone she trusted and never returned, that whatever happened to her wasn't ritualistic, it was personal and opportunistic, that the symbols at the scene, if they ever existed at all, were either misinterpreted or invented later. Others disagreed. They pointed to the location, the odd arrangement of sticks, the fact that no clear cause of death was ever found. They believed it was something darker, not just in action, but in meaning. Some believed the satanic panic of the 1980s had colored how people spoke about the case afterward, distorting the truth, magnifying fear. Others believed it was the opposite, that the signs had always been there, and authorities refused to acknowledge them. But again, there was no proof, just memory and suggestion and grief. Jeannette's family rarely spoke about the case publicly, and when they did, it was brief, respectful, wounded. They had lived through decades of speculation, much of it cruel or careless, To them, she wasn't a mystery. She was a daughter, a sister, a girl who went to church, liked music, and never came home, and they had never been given a real answer. In 2021, Union County authorities were asked again if the case would be reopened. They declined to comment, saying only that it remained unsolved. No charges had ever been filed, no suspects named, and no one had ever confessed. What remains is not justice, not even closure, just a hole in the past, too deep to fill. And yet, the story endures. People still walk through Watchung Reservation. They still look at the cliffs. They still wonder how a girl could vanish and be found in the open, surrounded by silence. Some see it as a failure of policing, some as a tragedy of timing, and some as proof that we'll never really know what lives in the woods we think we've mapped. Jeannette's story is a mirror of what we remember, of what we fear, of what we choose to believe when no one can tell us the truth. If you stayed with me this far, thank you. Stories like this aren't meant to scare you. They're meant to make you think, to listen more carefully, and to remember the names that history sometimes forgets. If you believe Jeannette deserves more, share her story. Talk about her. Don't let it fade, because somewhere out there, someone knows the truth, and maybe one day they'll speak. She arrived without notice. No ticket stub, no luggage, no name anyone remembered. There were no records of a hotel check-in, no photos from a train station, and no trace that she'd spoken to a single soul. It was as if she had simply stepped into the town of Portbou from nowhere, already half a mystery. The village itself was quiet, tucked between cliffs and sea on the Spanish border. It wasn't a place where people paid much attention to strangers. Travelers passed through, caught a train, maybe stayed a night, but rarely lingered. That's what made her presence even harder to place. She hadn't come to stay, and yet she never left. Locals barely noticed her at first. She left behind no receipts, no reservations, no passport. No one remembered selling her a ticket or handing her a room key. She seemed to move like a shadow through narrow streets, unseen, unclaimed, and unrecorded. For a while, the days passed uneventfully, but then rumors began to form in quiet conversations. Someone thought they saw her walking along the edge of the cemetery. Someone else said she asked a question no tourist would ask. A name was mentioned, then it wasn't mentioned again. Soon, the questions started to outweigh the facts. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why was she here? She hadn't been reported missing. No friends came looking. No family ever called. But something about her presence stayed. It settled over the town like fog, familiar but impossible to grasp. And what came next would leave more questions than answers. This is Night Echo. 4 true stories every week, told slowly and completely. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now, keep the lights low, let the rain continue, and listen closely. Portbou sits at the edge of Spain. It's a small border town squeezed between tall cliffs and the Mediterranean Sea. The kind of place where trains stop for just a few minutes, where travelers look out the window and keep moving. In the fall of 1990, nothing special was happening in Portbou. The town was quiet. The weather was nice. Most tourists had already gone home for the year. People swept their front steps, Cafes served coffee to the few remaining visitors, and life moved slowly, like it always did by the seas. Then one morning in early September, everything changed. Someone new arrived. She wasn't local. She barely spoke. She had no bags with her, and nobody knew where she came from. She didn't book a hotel room. She didn't try to make friends. She didn't seem to be waiting for anyone, but people noticed her. She was young, maybe 20 years old, blonde hair, pretty face. She dressed nicely but simply. She wasn't a backpacker or a drifter. She seemed like someone who had a plan. At the train station, she bought a one-way ticket from Suburb. That's a French town just across the border. It's only a few minutes away by train, but buying that ticket meant she had chosen to come to Spain, and she was traveling alone. People who saw her said she seemed calm. Others thought she looked lost in thought. One shop owner remembered her sitting by the harbor for over an hour, just staring at the water. She didn't eat anything. She didn't take pictures. She just watched. Then, without any warning, she started walking up a steep hill, past the edge of town, toward a place where most people don't go unless they have to. The path she took isn't for tourists. It winds around the old cemetery. It follows a trail through the pine trees, and eventually it disappears into the cliffs. Local people avoid that area, especially when it gets dark. The wind sounds different up there, louder, angrier. The trees grow thick and close together, and once you're inside the forest, you can't hear the ocean anymore. Someone later said they saw her stop at the cemetery gate. Another person remembered watching her walk into the trees, becoming just a shadow in the mist, and then she was gone. Nobody saw her come back down. Nobody saw her get on another train. There were no records of her crossing the border again. No phone calls, no hotel bookings, nothing. By the next day, it was like she had never been in Portbou at all. But she had been there. A few days went by. The wind got stronger. The smell of salt water drifted through the tree branches. And then someone saw something that didn't belong. A figure up in the pine trees, still, silent, not moving. She wasn't lying down. She wasn't hidden. She was just there. Her shoes were placed neatly on the ground below. A small gold necklace was tucked under her shirt collar. Her eyes, which had once looked out at the world, were now closed forever. The police were called. The Guardia Civil came first, then other emergency workers. They put up tape around the area. They took photographs. But they couldn't figure out who she was. She had nothing on her that would tell them. No ID card, no passport, no wallet, not even a piece of paper with her name on it. No purse, no phone, no documents, nothing. Her face wasn't damaged. Her hands weren't tied. There were no obvious signs that someone had hurt her. The way they found her looked careful, planned, like she had followed some kind of ritual that nobody had taught her. But somehow, she knew what to do. A medical examiner was brought in. The body was taken away, carefully, quietly. And then the question started. Was she Spanish? Nobody in Portbou recognized her. Was she French? There was no missing person report that matched her description across the border. Could she have come from somewhere farther away? They checked train records. They compared her description with missing person cases all across Europe. Interpol got involved, but they found nothing. No match, no name, no fingerprints in any database. Not in France, not in Spain, not anywhere. Some people thought she might have been a tourist who got lost. Others whispered that it was suicide. But if that's what happened, Where was the note she should have left behind? If she had killed herself, why did she do it so neatly, so quietly, so far from home? And the most disturbing question of all, why wasn't anyone looking for her? No family called the police. No friends reported her missing. No embassies got involved. No emails. No phone calls. Her story never appeared on the news. There were no missing person flyers, no appeals for help, no reward offers. Just a girl, alone, in the pine trees, with the sea below and a mystery that nobody could solve. The local people started calling her La Chica del Cementerio, the girl from the cemetery. Others just called her the Portbou girl. Over the next few weeks, a quiet investigation began. Her photograph was sent to police departments. Artists drew sketches of her face. Her fingerprints were sent to agencies across Europe. Still nothing. Eventually, they had to bury her. A simple grave in a quiet corner of the cemetery. The headstone didn't have her name on it, just a number, because nobody knew what else to write. And so she became a ghost. Not because she died, but because nobody knew who she was, because there were no answers, no family, no explanation. She stayed that way for decades, a nameless file in a forgotten case. A girl with no country, no story, and no past. All anyone knew was where her story ended, but not how it started, and not why it ended in the pine trees above Portbou. The Portbou girl became more than just a mystery. She became a feeling, a question that hung in the air, a silence that seemed to follow hikers who went too far up the mountain trail. And for over 30 years, that silence stayed, deep and patient and seemingly forever, until one day it finally broke. Time passed, not quickly, not loudly, just enough to wear the edges off memory. By the mid-1990s, the story of the unnamed woman found in the pine grove above Portbou had faded from public view. No one had claimed her. No name had surfaced. No new detail had come forward. And so, without answers, her file slipped quietly into the archives, if it was ever properly archived at all. The woman who had appeared, then vanished, then reappeared in death, was catalogued as desconocida, unknown. What little information existed was transferred into a small provincial case report under Girona jurisdiction. Cause of death? Undetermined. Age? Approximate. Believed non-Spanish national. Found near cemetery. No known belongings. No signs of violence. That was it. No photo was circulated to the public. No posters. No sketch. Not even a press release beyond the initial 3-line story in a local newspaper. It read like a clerical note. Foreign woman found deceased. Investigation underway. But the investigation didn't go anywhere, and it didn't last long. It didn't help that Portbou was, and still is, a border town. Records didn't cross countries easily back then. Missing persons cases from Italy, France, Austria, or Germany rarely made their way into the hands of small Spanish municipalities. There were no international alerts, no shared fingerprint databases, no Interpol bulletin, and without a name, there was no pressure, no family knocking on doors, no embassy calls, no lawyers, no media, no one. So when the trail went cold, it froze. She was buried in the Portbou cemetery, not in the older section where generations of locals lay, but off to the side, in a plain grave with a metal plate, no headstone, just a case number. And for over 3 decades, that's all she was, a number, a space between questions. Then, in the early 2000s, something strange happened. Her story began circulating online, not officially, not through police or the newspapers, but in whispers, on forums, blogs, websites, focused on European unsolved mysteries. There was no name, still no photo, just fragments. A young woman found dead in Portbou, alone, without ID, buried without a name. Some commenters speculated it was suicide. Others believed she had been fleeing something. A few even suggested she was running to something, a meeting, a purpose, a reckoning. And one thing stood out: the way she was found. Shoes placed neatly, necklace intact, blouse carefully buttoned, no evidence of panic, fear, or struggle. No clear reason for death, no note, no farewell. She had simply ended. People began referring to her as the Portbou girl. In 2019, her case appeared again, this time in a digital archive built by a non-profit attempting to connect missing persons with unidentified remains across Europe. Volunteers compiled open files, many long ignored or forgotten, and uploaded them to an international system that allowed for broader searches. One of them entered the limited details from the Portbou case. They had almost nothing. Female, estimated age, early 20s, found near Cemetery Cliffs, died around September 1990. Cause unknown, no identification. They uploaded it anyway, and that decision would change everything. In 2020, a cold case team in northern Italy began reviewing unresolved disappearances from the late 1980s and early 1990s. One case stood out: a woman named Eva Simeone Rauter. She had disappeared at age 26, last seen leaving her town in South Tyrol in late August 1990, heading south through Austria and into France. She was believed to be traveling alone. Her plan, unclear. She had no criminal record, no mental health history, and no reason to disappear. Her family had filed a report, but it had never reached Spain. The record stayed in Italy. They were never flagged across borders, until now. When the description of the Portbou case appeared in the digital archive, one of the Italian investigators noticed the resemblance. They requested access to the Girona records. What little existed. A match was suspected. Dental records were requested. Fingerprints, dusty and barely usable, were compared. And then came the confirmation: the woman buried in Portbou in 1990 was Eva Rauter. After 32 years, the girl from the cemetery had a name. It should have been the end of the mystery, but it wasn't, because the identification didn't bring answers. It raised more questions. Why had Eva traveled to Portbou? What was she doing in that town? Why did she walk toward the cliffs and not return? And why did it seem, even now, that her death had been quietly swept aside? Spanish officials confirmed her identity, but they offered no additional details. The original police file, incomplete. The autopsy report, gone. Scene photos, never digitized, possibly never taken. Fingerprints, stored in an unmarked envelope in a locked drawer, found only by chance. And the cause of death? Still undetermined. Some said she took her own life, but there were no signs of violence, no note, no rope or belt, no ligature marks in the surviving records. Others wondered whether she had been followed, but there were no suspects, no interviews, no witness logs, only vague statements from locals, and none had been recorded formally. It was as if her death hadn't been investigated at all, only logged, then buried, then forgotten. By 2023, journalists tried to reconstruct her story, but the trail had gone cold again. Too many people had retired, too many files had been misplaced, and perhaps most damning of all, too few people had ever cared to look in the first place. Today, Eva's grave has a new plaque. It bears her name, a date, and little else. Her story continues to appear in quiet corners of the internet, true crime forums, independent blogs, YouTube videos, people speculate, reconstruct, imagine. But the truth remains, a woman disappeared. Her death was ignored. And when her name finally surfaced, decades later, the world had already moved on. Evi Rauter is no longer unknown, but she is still unanswered. And some stories, once mishandled, never come back whole. The story of Evi Rauter should have ended with her name, but names don't fix what was broken. They don't explain why someone disappears across countries. They don't tell you why she ended up alone, miles from home, on a trail that few ever walk. Even now, over 30 years later, the hills above Portbou remember. Ask the locals, and they'll tell you about that stretch of pines above the cemetery. They'll tell you it feels different there. The path curves around in ways that seem to shift each season. The trees are denser than they should be. The air carries something heavier. Even hikers who've never heard the story often stop near that ridge and turn back without knowing why. It's not superstition. It's atmosphere. It's memory. And maybe that's all that remains of what happened. Eva had no luggage, no map, no booked return ticket. She was found less than 100 feet from the trail, elevated just above the cemetery wall, visible if you knew where to look, invisible if you didn't. Some believe she came there to die. Others think she was waiting for someone, and they never arrived. A few insist she never meant to end up there at all. But if that's true, how did she vanish without a trace? No one from the train station remembered her leaving. There were no reports of anyone else heading up the trail that day. The town was quiet, and still her final hours are locked away, not just by time, but by silence. Spain didn't preserve the case. Italy never followed up. Her family mourned, but the questions went unanswered for decades. And in the meantime, her grave sat unmarked, her identity stored in a forgotten drawer. There's no clear cause of death, no witnesses, no conclusions, just the stillness of the pine grove, the wind against stone, and the weight of a life that ended far from home, without reason, without justice, and for a long time, without a name. The town of Portbou doesn't talk much about her, but the hillside does. If you walk far enough, past the gate, around the bend, and up through the trees, you'll find a silence that doesn't feel like peace. You'll feel it. You might not see anything, but the moment will linger. And if you pause long enough, you may understand why some people believe the land still remembers her. Even after all these years, the questions remain. Why did she travel to Portbou alone? What was she searching for? And what really happened among the trees? Some stories end with closure, others with silence. This one ends with a name, but not with peace. Because even though we now know she was Evi Rauter, we still don't know why she came, or why no one looked, or how a girl so full of life vanished into shadow. And maybe we never will, but we remember her, and that matters. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it moved you, or unsettled you, or simply left you wondering, take a second to support this growing channel. Subscribe to Night Echo so you never miss another real-life horror. Like this video to help it reach others who walk the dark paths with us. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? Whether you're in the US, the UK, Australia, or somewhere quiet and strange, I want to know. Every comment, every share, every name helps keep these forgotten stories alive. New episodes drop 4 times a week, always real, always chilling, always faceless. Until next time, don't forget the ones the world tries to forget, because the past doesn't stay buried forever. It began like any other night. A cold December evening in Chicago, just days after Christmas. The streets still glittered with holiday lights, store windows still dressed in red and gold. People were out, shopping, laughing, breathing in the last days of the year. Barbara and Patricia Grimes were just two teenage girls heading to the movies. They'd done it dozens of times before. The neighborhood theater was only a short walk from home. They were going to see Elvis Presley, Love Me Tender, for the second time. They had a few coins in their pockets. Their mother told them not to stay out too late, and that was it. They left. The walk was familiar. Sidewalks they'd walked 100 times. Street lights flickering overhead. Other kids heading the same way. Nothing strange, nothing out of place, nothing to warn what was coming. They bought their tickets. They found their seats. The film began. And that's where the trail ends, because after the credits rolled, no one saw them again. Not walking home, not boarding a bus, not calling for help, nothing. The theater emptied, the city moved on, and by morning, the world had changed. It would be weeks before anyone found answers, but by then, the damage had already been done. This is Night Echo, 4 true stories every week, told slowly and completely. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now, keep the lights low and listen closely, because what started as a simple trip to the movies became one of the most haunting mysteries Chicago has ever known. Chicago, 1956. It was the final days of December, and the holidays had cast their usual glow over the city. Shop windows were still decorated with tinsel and blinking lights. Snow clung to sidewalks like an afterthought. And in the suburb of McKinley Park, the streets were quiet, just as they always were after Christmas. Barbara and Patricia Grimes weren't planning anything extraordinary that night, just a simple trip to the movies. A routine they had followed countless times before. They were sisters, close in age, closer in bond. Barbara was 15, Patricia just 13. In a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, they were familiar faces. The kind of girls who always walked together, talked together, laughed together. It was Friday, December 28th. The plan was simple. Catch the 7:30 showing of Love Me Tender at the Brighton Theater, just a few blocks from home. Elvis Presley was everything to them, Patricia especially. She had already seen the movie over a dozen times, but it didn't matter. For teenage girls in 1956, Elvis wasn't just a singer, he was a movement, a dream. They left the house around 7:15, dressed neatly in wool coats, $1.50 between them. No one worried. No one thought twice. It was the kind of outing that required no questions. But it was also the last time anyone saw them alive. What followed in the days, weeks, and months after their disappearance would grip the entire city in fear and confusion. Their case would become one of the largest missing persons investigations in Chicago history. And still, it would end with more questions than answers. But on that cold December night, none of that had happened yet. The Grimes sisters simply walked down their street, chatting about Elvis and the movie, the snow crunching beneath their shoes. They reached the theater on time. The cashier remembered them. They paid for 2 tickets and entered the lobby with a small crowd of other teens. But what happened after that is where the mystery begins. Some witnesses would later claim they saw the girls inside the theater, laughing, watching the screen, sitting near the front. Others insisted they left early. One boy swore he saw them getting into a car outside. Another said he spotted them at a nearby diner later that night. Still others claimed they were hitchhiking along the road. Too many accounts, too many contradictions. What is known for certain is that Barbara and Patricia never made it home that night. When the movie ended, their mother Loretta began to worry. It wasn't like them to be late, not without calling. She waited a little longer. Midnight passed, then 1 in the morning. By 2, she called the police. What began as a missing persons report quickly escalated into something far bigger. By the next day, the news had spread across the city. 2 young sisters gone without a trace, no signs of a struggle, no known enemies, no logical explanation. The investigation exploded. Over 300,000 flyers were distributed. Police combed the area on foot, horseback, even helicopters, canvassing door to door, interviewing neighbors, following every possible lead. And the sightings kept coming in, dozens of them. The girls were reportedly seen boarding a bus in Cicero, at a skating rink in Indiana, inside a hotel in Nashville, walking down roads hundreds of miles apart, always together, always silent. But every lead went cold. Every witness contradicted the next, and none of it made sense. The press had a field day. Papers ran headlines daily. Reporters hounded the family. Loretta pleaded for privacy, but also for help. Her voice on the radio, asking her daughters to come home, promising they wouldn't be punished, begging anyone who saw them to speak up. But the phone never rang with the call she needed. Just static and silence. The first few days after Barbara and Patricia Grimes vanished felt like someone had hit pause on the normal rhythm of the neighborhood. People still went to work. School buses still rumbled down the block. Radio still played Elvis Presley's Love Me Tender on the hour, every hour. But underneath it all, something was off, like the city was holding its breath, waiting for something that never came. By Saturday morning, it had been over 24 hours since anyone had seen the Grimes girls. Loretta hadn't slept, not really. She'd drift off in a chair now and then, but her eyes never seemed to stay closed. She'd already called every friend she could think of, visited the theater, driven along Archer Avenue half a dozen times. Still, no Barbara, no Patricia. She made another call to the police. This time, they listened. The initial theory had been simple. 2 teenagers out late, probably ran off with friends or a couple of boys. They'll be back when they're hungry. But Loretta knew her daughters. They wouldn't have run off, and they wouldn't have ignored her voice on the answering machine, begging them to call. Something wasn't right. By the afternoon, the Chicago Police Department officially opened a missing persons case. That evening, WGN Radio broke the news. 2 Chicago sisters aged 13 and 15 missing since December 28th after seeing an Elvis film. That was all it took. The calls started coming in. Dozens at first, then hundreds. One man said he'd seen 2 girls fitting their description at a local diner in Cicero. A waitress swore they'd been in her booth on New Year's Eve. Another caller, this one from Indiana, claimed the girls had hitched a ride to Nashville. One woman insisted she saw them walking into a hotel in Memphis, their arms linked, giggling. The stories were vivid, detailed, convincing, but none of them matched. For every witness who placed them downtown, another placed them near the lake, or in a drugstore on the south side, or boarding a Greyhound, Theories spun up like dust devils. They'd run away to meet Elvis. They were escaping a troubled home life. They were rebelling. The problem was, none of those things were true. Barbara and Patricia had been happy. No signs of trouble at school. No secret boyfriends. No diary entries filled with escape fantasies. They'd gone to see a movie and never come home. By Monday, January 7th, the story had gone national. The FBI stepped in. The girls' photos were printed on milk cartons, slipped into mailboxes, taped to telephone poles. Volunteers canvassed theaters, diners, and parking lots. More than 15,000 people were interviewed. Police opened over 300 reported sightings. Every one of them led nowhere. Loretta refused to stop hoping. She stood at the kitchen table day after day, answering calls from strangers, reporters, and supposed psychics. Some callers kind, others cruel. A few told her the girls were dead. One said they'd been taken by a cult. One woman even mailed Loretta a map with 2 red X's marked grave. Loretta kept them all, just in case. Somewhere along the way, something strange began to happen. The story of Barbara and Patricia started to split in two. There was the official investigation, where detectives reviewed reports, filed statements, and dismissed false leads. Then there was the public version, fueled by rumor, whispered at bus stops, passed across pews at Sunday Mass. In the official version, the Grimes girls were still missing. In the public version, they had become everything from runaways to ghosts. But then something changed. A man named Edward Benny Bedwell walked into the picture. He was 21 years old, a drifter, worked odd jobs in and around Chicago, thin, scruffy, with wild hair and a slow drawl. He bore a striking resemblance to Elvis Presley. When he was brought in for questioning, Benny told a strange story. He claimed he'd seen Barbara and Patricia in the company of another man named Frank. They'd all gone to a bar, then to a house on the west side. There had been drinking, dancing. At one point, Benny claimed the girls told him their mother didn't care what they did. Then, just as suddenly, he changed his story. Now he said the girls had stayed with them for over a week, that they had left on their own, that maybe they'd headed south. The details shifted with every retelling. One minute he was with them, the next he wasn't. One version placed them in Indiana, another in a Chicago flophouse. None of it made sense, but the public latched onto it. It was something, a lead, a name. And when Benny Bedwell was arrested, people thought the case was finally breaking open, but it wasn't. His confession didn't line up. The timeline was wrong. No evidence backed it up. Eventually, it came out that he'd been coerced, kept in custody for days, fed information, pressured into talking. He was released weeks later. Just like that, the lead fell apart. As the days dragged on, so did the fear. By mid-January, the tone in the neighborhood had shifted. Doors were locked earlier. Parents walked their kids to school. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. The Grimes family couldn't go outside without reporters circling. Loretta, exhausted and haunted, stopped answering the phone. And still, the girls were missing. Weeks turned into a month. Posters began to peel from walls. The public moved on, but the Grimes family didn't. Not for 1 second. Then, on January 22nd, nearly a full month after the girls vanished, a phone call came into the Cook County Sheriff's Office. A man named Leonard Prescott had seen something near a desolate stretch of road in Lyons Township, just off German Church Road, south of Chicago. Two shapes, side by side, pale, motionless. Deputies were dispatched, and what they found would end the search. By the third week of January 1957, the city of Chicago was no longer just concerned. It was afraid. What had begun as a missing persons case had transformed into something far darker and more confusing. The disappearance of Barbara and Patricia Grimes had gone from a family's private heartbreak to a civic mystery unfolding on the front pages and radio waves. The police investigation had widened its scope dramatically. Dozens of officers were assigned full-time. Every tip, no matter how small or strange, was written down. Canvassing efforts expanded well beyond the McKinley Park neighborhood. Forest preserves, empty buildings, even drainage tunnels were searched. Detectives were seen pacing through alleys, interviewing bus drivers, cinema ushers, shopkeepers, and anyone who might have seen the girls that night. But the problem wasn't a lack of information, it was the opposite. Leads came in by the hundreds, each one contradicting the next. Some witnesses swore they had seen the girls the morning after they vanished, alive and laughing. Others claimed they had been seen in distant suburbs, with a man without a man boarding a bus or walking into a diner. Some tips came from psychics. Some were anonymous letters. None of them led anywhere. At one point, a woman in Nashville claimed the girls had been in her restaurant. Another woman in Indiana insisted she'd seen Barbara and Patricia in a car with two boys heading south. Police followed every trail, every bus ticket, every diner check stub. The reports always ended the same. The girls were not there. The Grimes family, already devastated, was caught in a web of hope and disappointment. Loretta Grimes, their mother, stayed by the phone. She refused to change the girls' bedroom, refused to let their laundry be touched. She believed they were alive. She believed they had been taken. And she believed someone was covering something up. But the longer the case stretched on, the stranger the public response became. Young girls began reporting sightings of Patricia and Barbara at their schools. Boys claimed they had spoken to them downtown. A local radio DJ even announced a $1,000 reward for information, fueling even more calls and false sightings. Soon, the investigation took on a bizarre life of its own. An older woman claimed she had seen a spirit of the girls near a church. A janitor at a school claimed to have found a clue in the girls' handwriting scrawled on a bathroom wall. Police, now desperate, entertained them all. Meanwhile, the press continued to run daily updates, though facts were increasingly scarce. The case had gone national. Reporters from New York and California wrote about the Grimes sisters. Their smiling faces, taken from school portraits, were printed again and again, always side by side, always under the same question: where are Barbara and Patricia? But the truth was, the case was slipping away. The longer the girls remained missing, the less likely it seemed they would be found alive. Though no one said it out loud, not at first. People had started to expect the worst. Still, without bodies, there was room to hope. And so the search continued. Then came the freezing cold morning of January 22nd, 1957, 26 days after the girls were last seen. A man named Leonard Prescott, a construction worker, was driving along German Church Road in unincorporated Willow Springs just outside Chicago. The road was surrounded by brush and ditches, mostly used by locals. Prescott noticed something strange as he passed a section of the road near a rural turnout. In the distance, something pale caught his eye, just beyond a guardrail down an embankment. At first, He thought it was a pair of mannequins discarded in the cold, but something about the way they lay made him stop. He returned later with his wife, and then he called the police. What they had seen were not mannequins. The bodies of two young girls were lying just off the side of the road, partially covered in snow. Their coats were missing. Their hands were bare. They were laid out, side by side, almost as if they had been placed there. The position was strange. It did not look like they had fallen. It did not look like they had been dragged. Their skin, though cold and pale, showed no immediate signs of wounds or violence. Their hair was neat, their faces peaceful. The police arrived quickly, but the scene was already compromised. Locals had gathered, news reporters had arrived before the area was fully secured. Footprints were trampled, tire tracks were disrupted, evidence lost. Still, what remained was undeniable. Barbara and Patricia Grimes had been found, but their condition raised more questions than it answered. There were no visible signs of struggle, no stab wounds, no gunshots, no ligature marks, no bruises that could explain what had happened. Autopsies were ordered immediately. The bodies were taken to the Cook County morgue. But what the coroners found only deepened the mystery. Though the cold had preserved the girls' bodies to some extent, it also complicated the examination. The estimated time of death was inconsistent. Some reports said they had died within hours of disappearing. Others suggested they had survived for days. In the end, the official conclusion was vague and troubling. The cause of death could not be determined with certainty. Barbara had traces of alcohol in her system. Patricia did not. There were small abrasions, faint bruises, but nothing that could clearly explain how they had died. One coroner believed they had died from shock or exposure, another suspected suffocation. A third was convinced the bodies had been kept elsewhere, possibly refrigerated, and placed in the ditch after death. The manner of their deaths, the lack of injuries, and the strange condition of their bodies left investigators with more confusion than clarity. Who would abduct two young girls and then leave their bodies in plain sight without any clear signs of violence? Why were their coats and belongings missing? And why would someone go to the trouble of preserving their appearance only to dump them on a roadside weeks later? Public reaction was immediate and explosive. The press ran wild with theories. The police were criticized for mishandling the scene. Rumors of cover-ups and incompetence began to circulate, but behind the noise, the facts were few. The Grimes sisters were gone. Their family was shattered, and the truth was still out there, buried under snow, silence, and a case that was only growing colder. For weeks, their names lingered in newspaper headlines, accompanied by grainy photos and echoing questions no one could answer. Barbara and Patricia Grimes, gone without a trace. Then found, but not found whole, not found with peace. Now the investigation stood still. There was no clear cause of death, no suspect in custody, no motive that made sense, and no direction for the public to follow except backward, into fear, into rumor, into theory. Because when facts grow quiet, stories take over. And in this case, the stories never stopped. Some of the earliest suspicions revolved around the location where the girls were found. German Church Road, a secluded stretch in Willow Springs, far from the lights of Chicago, far from where two teenage girls might have wandered on their own. It wasn't just that it was remote. It was the kind of place you had to know to reach. A back road known to locals and, some whispered, to men who didn't want to be seen. One theory was simple. They had been killed elsewhere, then left there deliberately, dumped like evidence, displayed just out of reach. But that raised its own questions. Why that road? Why that field? And how did they end up in the exact spot a man just happened to see from his truck cab that morning? It felt staged. Others focused on the autopsy, or what little was revealed from it. The official findings were vague. Hypothermia, perhaps. No signs of trauma, but also no explanation for why their bodies showed signs of preservation, despite lying in the cold for weeks. The coroner's timeline didn't match the weather reports. Their stomach contents didn't match their last known meals. And their skin showed less exposure than it should have for girls left out in a field for nearly a month. Whispers followed. Had the girls really died that same night? Or had they been kept somewhere, hidden, alive, for a while? There were also the sightings, dozens of them. In the days after their disappearance, people claimed to see Barbara and Patricia in diners, on buses and theaters. Some insisted they were seen with older men. One woman swore she served them breakfast in Indiana. A taxi driver claimed he picked them up and dropped them near a park. The police chased these leads. They interviewed witnesses, but nothing stuck. Still, the volume of the sightings raised questions. Could they all be wrong? Or were the girls moving before they stopped? The most infamous theory came from a man who inserted himself into the case early on, Edward Benny Bedwell. A 21-year-old drifter from Tennessee, Bedwell bore a striking resemblance to Elvis Presley, enough to attract attention in mid-century America. He was working odd jobs, washing dishes, sleeping in cheap rooms, moving from place to place. And then he confessed. He told police he and a friend had been drinking with two girls who fit Barbara and Patricia's description. Said they had hung out together for days, visiting bars and cheap motels. He said they died accidentally after a night that turned violent, that they'd panicked, hid the bodies, left town. But the confession didn't match the timeline. It didn't match the autopsy. And it didn't match the details that investigators hadn't released to the public. Within days, he recanted. He claimed he'd been pressured, threatened, told what to say, that the police wanted a story. So he gave them one. The charges were dropped, but the damage lingered. Others suspected organized crime. Chicago in the 1950s wasn't just a city of diners and drive-ins. It was a city ruled by shadows, mobsters, racketeers, and people who knew how to make things, and people disappear. Some believed the girls had seen something they shouldn't. Others thought they were taken as part of something darker. But those theories, too, dissolved under scrutiny. There was no evidence, no names, no link, only suggestion, only fear. Then came the more personal theories. People looked inward, at teachers, neighbors, classmates. There was a bus driver who drove the route the girls might have taken, a man with a quiet past and a house not far from where the bodies were found. There was a boy who had once asked Barbara out, angrily refused. He was questioned, then cleared. Even their own family wasn't spared. For a moment, suspicion turned toward their father, a grieving man, a quiet man, a man who seemed composed during interviews, who didn't cry on cue. It was baseless, but the media ran with it. In time, the theories stacked up like bricks in a wall, not one solid enough to stand on its own, but together enough to block the light. The Grimes case became an echo chamber in 1957, then in 1965, 1974, 1988, 1996. Journalists would reopen the file, True crime authors would write new chapters. TV specials would revive the photos, the theories, the doubts. But never the answers, because the truth, if it ever existed in one place, was lost in the noise. And then came something stranger, something quieter, something almost folkloric. Some said the girls were still seen, ghosts at the corner of 3rd by 5th Street, whispers in the alley behind the theater, figures walking hand in hand along the edge of Archer Avenue before vanishing behind streetlights. Not real sightings, but memories that refused to fade. Grief turned into story. Story turned into haunting. Because the scariest part of a mystery isn't just what happened. It's that it keeps happening in the minds of those who remember. The Grimes case wasn't cold. It was frozen, suspended in time, and that's where it remained until something else thawed it loose. Decades passed, but the case never really left. It sat in drawers, whispered through newsrooms, referenced in police classrooms as a lesson in what not to let slip away. Every so often, a retired detective would mention it. A new article would bring the photos back, and someone, always someone, would ask, why haven't they solved it? There were still files, still fingerprints, still boxes with papers browned at the edges full of names that no longer meant anything. Even the coroner's report, so carefully worded, felt more like a question than an answer. In 2013, a retired investigator claimed to know the truth. He said a man confessed to him years ago. Said he picked the girls up that night. Said he panicked when one resisted. Said he didn't mean for them to die, but that man was gone, dead. And so was the detective who said he heard the story. There was no recording, no written report, just a claim. Too late to prove, and still Chicago remembers. The theater where they were last seen, it's gone now. The corner they stood on, rebuilt, the old roads repaved, but the story lingers. Barbara and Patricia. Not a headline, not a myth, just two sisters who went out to see a movie and never came home. Their graves are quiet now, but every so often flowers still appear. No note, no name, just a silent acknowledgement they are not forgotten. And maybe that's the only justice they'll ever have. They were just two girls heading out to see a movie, a December night, a city they trusted, and somewhere along the way, that trust was broken. What happened to Barbara and Patricia Grimes remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in Chicago's history. Not because it's the only one, but because of how quickly it slipped away and how long the silence lasted after. Sometimes it's not the horror that stays with us, it's the absence, the gaps between what we know and what we never will. If this story stayed with you, if it haunted you the way it's haunted this city for decades, subscribe to Night Echo for more true stories told slowly and completely. We bring you 4 new mysteries every week, always real, always chilling, always faceless. And before you go, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? U.S., U.K., Canada, Australia, or somewhere colder, quieter, stranger? Drop it below. Let's see where the echo reaches. Like the video, share it with someone who walks the dark roads with us. And don't forget, some stories never rest. Not in daylight, not in death, and not in memory. Until next time, keep your lights low and your ears open, because the past doesn't stay buried forever.